At my granddaughter's graduation ceremony, my daughter leaned in and whispered something she thought no one else would notice. She said that I was going to embarrass them because I was in a wheelchair, and I quietly held back my tears. The following day, I made a decision and removed them all from my will. I'm grateful that you are here with me. Please stay until the very end of my story and share the city you are watching from so I can see how far it has reached. That morning, I spent 2 full hours getting ready, which was much longer than I had allowed myself in recent months. My hands trembled slightly as I applied my lipstick, choosing the same coral shade I had worn to every important family occasion for 30 years. This was the day of Emily's graduation from Berkeley. Even after everything my body had gone through since the stroke 3 years earlier, I was determined to be present. The wheelchair felt heavier than usual as Avery pushed me across the campus courtyard. The California sun rested warmly on my face, and for a brief moment, I let myself feel proud. My granddaughter, 18 years old and incredibly bright, was graduating. I had helped pay for her education, just as I had done for Avery many years before. Avery mentioned that the ceremony would begin in 10 minutes, and her voice carried a tightness that I assumed came from excitement. She had always been anxious about timing and presentation. My daughter had always been concerned about appearances. We took our seats in the designated wheelchair section, and I noticed how Avery kept glancing around with her jaw clenched. She smoothed her navy dress for the 3rd time, and checked her phone again and again. I gently asked if she was looking for someone, trying to start a conversation. She replied that she was only checking whether her husband's family had arrived, and she said this without turning to look at me. Those relatives from my former in-laws had barely acknowledged me, even before I started using a wheelchair. Around us, families spoke with excitement, grandparents radiated pride, and parents captured photos. I reached into my purse to take out my own camera, an old digital one that Emily had patiently taught me to use the previous Christmas. That was the moment when I heard her say that I was going to embarrass them because of the wheelchair. The words came from directly behind me. It was Avery's voice, quieter than usual, clearly meant to stay private and be heard only by the person next to her. However, in my 70 years of life, my hearing had never failed me. My hand stopped halfway to my purse, and suddenly the camera felt far too heavy to hold. Another voice followed, a man's voice, which I recognized as Daniel, her husband of 5 years. He spoke in a low tone, pointing out that I could hear what she was saying. Avery responded by saying that I could hardly hear anything anyway, but she did not lower her voice enough. She continued, mentioning that people were staring and pointing out that someone from their social circle was sitting just a couple of rows away, wondering aloud what that person might think. At that moment, I felt my chest tighten. It was a familiar sensation that had stayed with me since the stroke, but this time it was different. It was not physical in the usual sense. It felt deeper, as if I were drowning while sitting completely still. The ceremony began, yet I could not focus on the speeches or the music. All I could hear was my daughter's voice repeating in my mind that I was going to embarrass them. This was the same daughter I had raised alone after her father passed away when she was 12 years old. The same daughter whose college education I had paid for by working double shifts as a nurse. The same daughter who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me that she believed I was the bravest person she knew. When Emily's name was called, I managed to clap. She walked across the stage with confidence, her red hair glowing in the sunlight just like Avery's had before she began dyeing it blonde. She looked toward our section and waved, her smile so bright that it made my chest ache. After the ceremony, she hurried over to us, her graduation cap slightly tilted and her diploma held tightly in her hands. She excitedly asked me if I had seen her walk across the stage, kneeling beside my wheelchair and looking at me with shining eyes. I told her that I had seen everything and that I was incredibly proud of her, trying to keep my voice steady. Avery stepped forward immediately, taking control of the moment, and said that we should take photos before all the best spots were gone. She began positioning herself next to Emily. As Daniel continued taking photo after photo, I noticed how Avery carefully adjusted their positions, making sure that I was either partially hidden or completely out of the frame. When other families came over to congratulate Emily, Avery would subtly move in front of me, blocking me from view. The drive home felt unbearable. Emily left with her boyfriend, and I remained in the car with Avery and Daniel. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft sound of the radio. I stared out the window at the passing houses, each one representing families that I imagined were happier than ours. Families where grandmothers were not seen as something embarrassing, and where love did not depend on conditions. When we arrived at my house, Avery helped me move from the car into my wheelchair with the mechanical precision of someone completing an unpleasant task. Her touch was careful, but it carried no warmth or connection. She said that they would see me next week while already stepping back toward her car, and she added that Emily wanted to take me to lunch before starting her summer internship. I wanted to ask if she would be joining us, but I already knew the answer. Avery had been finding reasons to avoid spending time with me ever since the wheelchair became a permanent part of my life. That night, alone in my house with only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, I sat in the living room and looked at the wall filled with family photos. Images of Avery's childhood, her wedding, Emily's school events. A lifetime of memories suddenly felt false. The words about me being an embarrassment kept repeating in my mind. I finally understood something that had been building for months. To my daughter, I was no longer her mother. I had become something to manage, a burden to hide. And the next day, I decided that I would do something about it. Sleep did not come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind running through decades of memories that now felt changed by what I had heard. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched to its limit so that I could give her the life I believed she deserved. I remembered the day her father died, when Avery was 12 years old and already old enough to understand that he would never come home again. I found her in her room that night, holding tightly to the baseball mitt he had given her for her birthday just 2 months earlier. She asked me, in a quiet and uncertain voice, if I was also going to leave her. I held her close, gently stroking her hair, and promised her that nothing in this world would ever take me away from her. That promise shaped every decision I made for the next 26 years, and working double shifts at the hospital became a normal part of my life. I worked 18-hour days that left me completely exhausted. Yet I stayed focused on providing everything I could for Avery. While other mothers attended PDA meetings and school plays, I spent my time changing bedpans and monitoring 4 lines, saving every possible dollar for her future. I gave up vacations, stopped buying new clothes, and no longer went out to dinner with friends. My social life disappeared entirely. When Avery was accepted to Stanford, I took out a second mortgage on the house to cover what her scholarships did not pay. When she decided she wanted to study abroad during her junior year, I added extra weekend shifts for 6 months, so it could happen. Looking back, the irony is impossible to ignore. I pushed myself to the limit, so she would never have to struggle the way I did. And she didn't. She graduated without debt, married a successful architect, and built a life in a beautiful home in Marin County. It was everything I had ever hoped she would have. Somewhere along the way, though, I became invisible to her. The stroke did not create that distance, it only made it impossible to ignore. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers clumsy against the screen. It was early in the morning, but I needed to hear another human voice. I scrolled through my contacts, searching for someone to call, someone who might understand me. The list was shorter than I remembered. Most of my former colleagues from the hospital had already retired or moved away. The few numbers that remained belonged to people I had not spoken to in months. I found myself wondering when my world had become so small. The next morning, I told my caregiver that I needed to go out by myself. Isabella immediately objected and reminded me that Avery had clearly instructed her not to allow me to drive or go anywhere alone. She explained that my daughter would be very upset with her if she allowed it. I looked directly at her and explained calmly that I was 70 years old and had been making my own decisions for far longer than my daughter had been alive. I made it clear that I was going to the bank, and I would be going alone. Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she stopped arguing and helped me into the car. The hand controls that had been installed after my stroke still felt unfamiliar, but I managed to drive along the streets I knew so well until I reached First National Bank. Mr. Caldwell, who had been my financial advisor for 15 years, looked genuinely surprised to see me. In recent meetings, Avery had always been present, gradually taking over my financial matters under the explanation that it was too stressful for me to handle them myself. He stood to greet me and asked how he could assist me. I told him that I needed a complete picture of my financial situation, including my house, my savings accounts, my investments, and everything else. He seemed confused and mentioned that we had reviewed this information just the previous month when Avery had been there. He added that she had expressed concern about the costs of my long-term care. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Avery had been discussing my finances behind my back. He confirmed that she had power of attorney, and that she had wanted to understand my assets in case I needed to move into a care facility. Then he hesitated and asked whether she had discussed this with me. I remembered signing those documents 2 years earlier, shortly after I had been discharged from the hospital. At the time, Avery had explained that it was simply a precaution, something that would allow her to help if I were ever unable to make decisions on my own. I asked him what exactly she had been asking about. He shifted slightly in his chair and explained that she had been particularly interested in the value of my home and whether I had considered selling it. She had suggested that maintaining such a large property might be becoming too difficult for me. My house, the 3-bedroom Craftsman in Berkeley that my late husband and I had purchased 40 years earlier. It was the place where Avery had taken her first steps, lost her first tooth, and brought home her first boyfriend. I had nearly lost it twice while paying for her education. Yet I fought to keep it because it represented everything we had built together. I asked if she had mentioned anything about my will. His expression grew more uncomfortable as he explained that she had asked about the process of updating estate documents, and had said that I had been considering making changes. But I had not been discussing any changes. I had not spoken to Avery about my will in years. I stated firmly that I wanted to review all of my accounts and understand exactly what authority the power of attorney gave her. As he pulled up my financial records, I began to grasp the full extent of what had been happening. Avery had not simply been helping me manage things. She had been preparing for the end of my life, evaluating my worth as if I were already gone. The house was valued at $1,200,000 in the current market. My retirement savings and investments totaled another $400,000. It was a considerable inheritance for someone who seemed to view me as little more than an embarrassment. Mr. Caldwell carefully suggested that if I had concerns about my daughter's involvement, we should discuss my options. I looked at him, remembering how he had helped me navigate the financial difficulties of widowhood and single parenthood for 15 years. He had never seen me as helpless. Even now, after the stroke and in this wheelchair, I was still the same person who had built this life from nothing. I told him that I wanted to make changes to my will, and that I also intended to revoke the power of attorney. He raised his eyebrows slightly and pointed out that it was a significant decision, asking if I was certain. I thought about Avery's voice at the graduation, about the way she had spoken about me. I thought about her meeting here without my knowledge, calculating the value of my life while I was still living it. I realized that I had never been more certain of anything. When I left the bank that afternoon with a copy of my updated will in my purse, I felt something I had not experienced in years. I felt a sense of control. For the first time since the stroke, I was making decisions about my own life again. Avery was about to learn that treating her mother as an embarrassment would bring consequences she had never expected. The meeting with my lawyer was scheduled for Tuesday morning, 3 days after what I had realized at the bank. I chose Arthur Langley, not because he was the most expensive attorney available, but because he had prepared my original will 20 years earlier and understood the seriousness of what I was about to do. His office looked almost exactly the same as I remembered, with the same mahogany furniture, the same rows of law books, and the same atmosphere that encouraged careful thought rather than impulsive decisions. This time, however, there was nothing impulsive about my choice. He greeted me and remarked that it had been a long time, adding that my call had surprised him. I responded by acknowledging that his reaction was understandable. I positioned my wheelchair across from his desk, in the very same place where I had sat decades earlier, planning for a future that I believed would include a grateful daughter. I told him that I needed to make some changes to my estate. Arthur had aged gracefully into his 70s, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him a distinguished appearance. He had been practicing law longer than Avery had been alive, and I trusted him completely when it came to discretion. Before we begin, he said as he leaned back in his chair, he wanted to be certain that I had carefully considered this decision, reminding me that changes to an estate can have lasting consequences, especially when family is involved. I took out the folder I had prepared, filled with bank statements, property evaluations, and a handwritten list of everything I wanted. I explained that I had been thinking about this for much longer than he might assume. The truth was that these thoughts had started after my stroke, though not for the reasons he might expect. At first, my intention had been to make things easier for Avery, to ensure she would not have to deal with complicated legal matters while grieving. I had even considered simplifying everything and possibly transferring some assets to her while I was still alive. That was before I fully understood how she truly saw me. I told him clearly that I wanted to remove Avery as my primary beneficiary. I specified that the house, the savings, the investments, everything, should no longer go to her. Instead, I wanted all of it to be left to the Elder Care Foundation. Arthur's pen paused above his notepad. He pointed out that this was a very significant change, and reminded me that my estate was worth over $1,500,000. He asked if I was absolutely certain about such a decision. I told him that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Then I leaned slightly forward in my wheelchair, and added that I still wanted to provide for Emily. I explained that I wanted a trust fund created for her education and future, but one that Avery would not be able to access or control in any way. For the next hour, we worked through all the details. Emily would receive $200,000 in a trust that would cover her graduate education and help her begin her adult life. The remainder, nearly $1,400,000, would go to the Elder Care Foundation, an organization that supports and advocates for elderly people who have been neglected or mistreated by their families. Arthur warned me that this decision would come as a shock to my daughter, and asked if I had considered discussing it with her beforehand. I thought about Avery's voice at the graduation, about how she had positioned herself to keep me out of photos, and about her private meetings with my financial advisor. I explained that some conversations are better held after the decision has already been made. As he prepared the documents, I felt an unusual combination of sadness and relief. This was not the future I had once imagined when I held Avery as a baby, when I worked endless double shifts to pay for her education, or when I walked her down the aisle at her wedding. But it was the future her own choices had created. The irony was clear to me. I was using the very money I had sacrificed so much to earn, the assets built through decades of discipline and effort, to teach her what would likely become the most expensive lesson of her life. That evening, I sat in my living room with the new will safely locked in my desk drawer. The house felt different, almost as if the walls themselves sensed that everything had changed. I ate dinner alone, as I usually did, reheating a leftover casserole that Isabella had prepared earlier in the week. Just as I was finishing, my phone rang. Avery's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I considered ignoring the call, but curiosity made me answer. She greeted me in an overly cheerful tone, and asked how I was feeling. I replied that I was doing fine, though even calling her sweetheart now felt unfamiliar. She continued by explaining that she and Daniel had been discussing my situation, and believed it might be time to start looking into assisted living options. She said there was no urgency, but they wanted to be prepared. It became immediately clear to me why she had called. I asked her to explain what she meant, and she began describing how the house was too large and how my mobility issues made it unsafe for me to live alone. She mentioned facilities in Marin County, close to where she lived, places where I would have company, activities, and professional care. I closed my eyes as the realization settled in. This was not about concern for me. It was about convenience. It was about placing the problem somewhere out of sight, somewhere I would not appear in a wheelchair at important family events. I asked her quietly if she had been speaking with Mr. Caldwell about selling my house. There was a pause long enough to confirm everything. She responded by saying they were simply trying to plan ahead and mentioned that the real estate market was strong. I told her clearly that I was not planning to move anywhere. She insisted that I needed to be reasonable and pointed out that I could not live in such a large house forever. She listed possible risks, such as falling or having another stroke, and reminded me that Isabella could not be with me at all times. I listened as she presented what sounded like logical and practical arguments. Everything she said seemed reasonable on the surface, except for one critical truth. It was not truly about my well-being. In the end, I told her that I would think about it, even though I already knew that I would not. She responded with enthusiasm and said she would begin making calls the next day and arrange visits to several places for the following week. After we ended the call, I moved my wheelchair toward the front window and looked out at the neighborhood where I had lived for 40 years. I saw the oak tree in the yard that Avery used to climb as a child, the sidewalk where she learned to ride her bicycle, and the porch where she once stood for her prom photos. Every corner of that house held a memory of our life together, and she was ready to let it go without hesitation. I picked up my phone again and called Arthur's office, leaving a message on his after-hours voicemail. I explained that I wanted to add one more condition to my will. If Avery ever attempted to have me declared incapable of making decisions or tried to move me into a care facility against my wishes, I wanted Emily's trust reduced to $50,000, with the rest going directly to the foundation. I wanted it to be clear that certain actions would have consequences. As I ended the call, I realized something important. For the first time in 3 years, I was no longer thinking like someone powerless. I was thinking like a woman who still had control over her life and her choices. And this was only the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since I updated my will, and Avery's efforts to push me toward assisted living had only grown stronger. She called every day with new information about places she had visited, brochures she wanted to show me, and waiting lists she had already added my name to without even asking for my permission. Each conversation felt like another nail in the coffin of our relationship. I had been careful to leave the new will document visible on my kitchen table that Tuesday morning, knowing it was the day Avery came to take me to my doctor's appointment. I placed it right next to my coffee cup and reading glasses, as if I had simply been going through it during breakfast. She arrived exactly on time, just as she always did. From my wheelchair, I watched her move around my kitchen, collecting my medications and checking that I had my insurance card. She commented that I really needed to organize my pills better, pointing out that this was exactly the kind of thing that would be much easier in assisted living, where everything would be managed for me. I said nothing and waited. It took her exactly 4 minutes to notice the legal papers on the table. She picked them up and asked what they were, her tone shifting from critical to curious. I calmly replied that it was just some paperwork I had been reviewing. As she began to read, I watched her face change. First confusion, then disbelief, and then something that looked like real pain. She said my name quietly and asked what it was. I told her that it was my new will. As she continued reading, the color slowly drained from her face. I had made sure the wording was clear and could not be misunderstood. She said that I had left everything to charity, her voice breaking on the word charity, as if it were something unacceptable. I explained that I had left everything to an organization that helps people like me. She lowered herself into the chair across from me, the document trembling slightly in her hands, and asked what I meant by people like me. I answered that I meant people whose families see them as burdens, and people who are considered embarrassing to be around. The realization hit her immediately. She struggled to respond, trying to say that she had not meant it that way. I reminded her of the graduation, of the moment when she believed I could not hear her properly, and of the words she had said about me being an embarrassment in a wheelchair. Tears began to run down her face, but I felt no satisfaction from them. If anything, they only made me feel even sadder. She tried to explain that she had simply been stressed during the ceremony and overwhelmed by the number of people. I told her that this was not about one comment at one event. It was about who she had become. It was about the private meetings with my financial advisor, the discussions about selling my house, and the waiting lists for facilities I had never agreed to consider. She cried openly now, her mascara leaving dark streaks down her face, insisting that she had only been trying to help and plan for my future. I told her that she had been treating me like a problem that needed to be managed. For several minutes, we sat in silence. She held the will tightly, and I looked at her, wondering when I had lost the daughter I once knew. Outside, I could hear children playing, their laughter sharply contrasting with the heavy atmosphere in my kitchen. Eventually, she said that I needed to change it back, her voice now firm. I told her that I did not have to change anything. She insisted that I was not thinking clearly and suggested that the stroke had affected my judgment, saying that I would regret this decision. I had expected that. I reminded her that Arthur Langley, the same attorney who had handled both my husband's estate and mine for 20 years, had prepared this will. I explained that he had spent 2 hours with me, asked many questions, and had me confirm my mental state. I pointed out that it would be difficult to convince anyone that a woman who built $1 million estate while raising a child alone had suddenly become incompetent at 70. Her tears stopped, replaced by something colder. She said that I was punishing her for trying to take care of me. I told her that I was protecting myself from someone who saw caring for me as a burden. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and said that I was throwing away 40 years of being her mother, and giving away everything her father had worked for and everything I had built. I said that her father would not be proud of the person she had become. The words hung in the air between us. Her face went pale, then flushed, and then pale again. She asked how I could say something like that. I explained that her father had loved me unconditionally, and had never once made me feel like a burden or an embarrassment. I told her that if he were alive, he would have taken care of me himself instead of looking for someone else to do it. She grabbed her purse angrily and said that I should not expect her help if I ever needed it, if I felt lonely, or if I realized what I had done. I quietly answered that I would not need to call her, because what I had already lost could not be lost again. She slammed the front door so hard that the windows shook. I heard her car start outside, the engine loud as she drove away. I sat alone in my kitchen, the will still lying on the table where she had dropped it. The silence felt different now, not empty, but clean, like the air after a storm. Within an hour, my phone rang again. It was Daniel. He spoke carefully, saying that Avery had told him what had happened, and that there might be some misunderstanding. I told him that there was no misunderstanding. He tried to explain that she could be intense, but that she cared and was worried about me. He suggested that we all sit down together and talk things through. I almost laughed, realizing that even he could not see how long things had been breaking apart. I told him that I appreciated what he was trying to do, but some things cannot be repaired and can only be rebuilt from the beginning. He asked me not to let pride destroy my family. I thought about that word and how it was being used. I told him that my family had already destroyed itself, and I was simply acknowledging it. That evening, alone in my house with the new will secured safely, I felt something I had not experienced in a long time. It was not happiness, but it was a sense of calm, a quiet relief from the constant tension that had followed me since the stroke. For the first time in 3 years, I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide what was best for me. I was not wondering anymore when the next conversation about my limitations would happen. I was not bracing myself for another moment of casual cruelty disguised as practical concern. I had taken back control of my life, and it felt like I could finally breathe again. The conflict truly began the following week. Avery's first step was to call Dr. Rivera, my neurologist, requesting a meeting to discuss concerns about my decision-making capacity. When that did not lead to the result she wanted, she contacted Adult Protective Services, claiming that I was being financially exploited by unreliable advisors. The social worker who came to my house was a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Linda Lynn. She sat across from me in my living room, her clipboard resting on her knees, asking questions that felt like a test I had not prepared for. She asked me to state the current year, and to name the current president, along with several other basic questions. I answered everything, feeling more irritated with each response. I knew where I lived. I could remember what I had eaten for breakfast. I understood the value of money. The evaluation was thorough and in the end completely in my favor. Linda explained as she packed up her papers that I had every right to make decisions about my own estate. She added that although my daughter seemed concerned, that concern did not override my independence. After she left, I called Arthur to inform him about what had happened. His response was exactly what I expected from someone who had spent 50 years practicing elder law. He said that situations like this were more common than people realized, and that adult children often struggle to distinguish between caring for their parents and controlling them. He reassured me that everything had been properly documented and that the will was secure. 3 days later, Emily came to my door. I had not seen my granddaughter since the graduation, and seeing her standing there with tears in her eyes nearly broke my resolve. She looked so much like Avery had at 18, with the same sharp features and determination, but she also had a gentleness that her mother had lost over time. She asked if we could talk, her voice filled with emotion. I let her in without hesitation. She was the only person in all of this who had done nothing wrong. She sat on my couch, in the same place where her mother used to sit as a child, and looked at me with serious green eyes that reminded me of my late husband. She said that her mother had told her about the will. I replied that I assumed she had. She explained that Avery had been crying for 3 days and believed that I hated her. I felt a tightness in my chest and told her that I did not hate her, but I could no longer pretend that everything between us was fine. Emily was quiet for a moment, gently picking at the pillow in her lap. She said that she knew about the comment at the graduation, explaining that she had overheard her mother speaking about it, and admitting that she might have said something hurtful. She looked at me and asked if that moment was really the reason I had made my decision. I tried to explain that it was not about one comment, but about a pattern that had been building for years. It was about gradually realizing that I was no longer seen as someone worthy of respect. I told her that things were complicated, because adulthood makes everything more complex. She responded by saying that even when things are complicated, some actions are still simply wrong. I looked at her carefully, searching for signs that she had been influenced, but Emily had always been independent. She had her mother's strength, but also a clear sense of right and wrong. I asked her what she thought I should do. She took time before answering, choosing her words carefully. She said that her mother had forgotten that I was still a person, not just a role in the family, but someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. Hearing that from her affected me more than anything else. She continued by saying that her mother was afraid, not about money or inheritance, but about losing me, and that fear can lead people to act poorly. I reached for her hand, struck by how much understanding she had at such a young age. I asked what she would do in my place. She admitted that she did not know, but said that she loved both of us and did not want to lose either of us because pride stood in the way of forgiveness. After she left, I sat in my living room as it grew dark outside. Her words stayed with me, mixing with memories of Avery as a child, as a teenager, and as a young woman. There had once been a daughter who held my hand during scary moments, who called me every day during her first week of college, who cried with happiness when she told me she was going to have a baby. But those memories were now shadowed by more recent ones. Less respect, more impatience, and small acts of cruelty that had slowly become normal. That night, I called Avery. She answered immediately, as if she had been waiting. I told her that this was not about money or revenge, but about dignity. She apologized and said that what she had said at the graduation was wrong and spoken out of stress and concern about appearances. She insisted that she did not truly feel that way. There was a long silence between us. Then she admitted that she did not know how to handle the situation, that she did not know how to take care of me without feeling like she was losing herself. It was the most honest thing she had said in a long time. I told her that I had never asked her to lose herself, only not to lose me. She was crying again, and I could hear it in her breathing. She said she did not know how to fix this. I answered that I did not know if it could be fixed, but I knew that it could not get worse than it already was. The question about what I wanted from her hung in the air between us. I found myself thinking about what I truly wanted. Was it an apology, a promise that things would change, or some kind of reassurance that she would never again see me as an embarrassment? I finally answered that I wanted her to truly see me, not as a problem that needed solving or a burden that had to be managed, but simply as her mother, someone who loves her and deserves to be treated as if she matters. She responded quietly that I did matter, and I told her that she needed to prove it. We ended that call without any clear resolution, but for the first time in months, it felt like we had at least been honest with each other. Whether that honesty would be enough to close the distance between us was uncertain, but at least we both understood exactly where we stood. 8 months have passed since that conversation, and I am writing this from my living room, in the same house that Avery once wanted to sell, surrounded by the life I chose to continue on my own terms. The changes did not happen quickly. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly, much like a bone healing after it has been fractured. But Avery has been making an effort, a real effort in ways that actually matter. She no longer talks about assisted living facilities. She no longer makes decisions about my life without asking me first. Most importantly, she has stopped treating my wheelchair as something shameful, and has begun to see it for what it truly is, a tool that allows me to remain independent. The turning point came 3 months ago during Emily's birthday dinner. We were at a restaurant, and when the hostess tried to place us at a table hidden in the back corner, clearly thinking the wheelchair would be less noticeable there, Avery spoke up. She firmly explained that her mother would prefer a table by the window. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. For the first time in years, someone was standing up for what I wanted instead of trying to manage how I appeared. Since then, we have had difficult conversations, honest ones about the time after my stroke. She spoke about how overwhelmed she had felt trying to help me while also managing her own life. I spoke about how abandoned I had felt when that help started to feel more like control than care. She admitted during one of those conversations that she had been so afraid of losing me to another stroke that she began acting as though I was already gone, as if I were no longer really her mother, but something fragile she had to protect. I understood that fear more than I wanted to admit. The stroke had changed my life, had taken away some of my independence, and had forced me to rely on others in ways I never had before. But I was still myself, still the woman who raised her, still someone with thoughts, opinions, and the right to make my own choices. The will has not been changed, not out of anger, but because I have come to understand something important over these past months. I do not need someone to take care of me financially. What I need is emotional care, to be treated with dignity and respect, the same way every person deserves. Emily now visits every Sunday. She brings her laundry, and we fold it together while she talks about her studies, her internship, and her plans for graduate school. Sometimes Avery joins us, and we cook dinner together in my kitchen. 3 generations of women learning how to care for each other without conditions. Last week, Emily asked me if I would teach her how to drive using hand controls. I asked her why she would want to learn something like that. She answered that one day she might need to know, and that she wanted to understand what my world feels like. At that moment, it became clear to me that this 18-year-old understood something that had taken her mother 45 years to learn. Supporting someone's limitations is not about making them feel normal. It is about making them feel valued. Arthur still calls from time to time, checking if I want to make any changes to my estate. I always give him the same answer. The will remains exactly as it is, not because I want to punish Avery, but because I want to protect myself. The money will go to people who truly need it, and that knowledge brings me more peace than any inheritance ever could. I have also started volunteering with the Elder Care Foundation, the organization that will one day receive my estate. Once a week, Isabella drives me there, where I answer calls and help other seniors navigate the emotional challenges of aging in families that do not always understand them. This experience has shown me how common stories like mine are, and how fortunate I am that mine was able to change direction. Yesterday, Avery brought me a photo album. She had gathered pictures of our family over the years, but arranged them differently than I expected. Instead of placing them in order of time, she organized them around moments of connection. Me reading to her when she was sick, her helping me in the garden as a teenager, the 2 of us at her college graduation, both of us crying with pride. She explained that she wanted to remember who we had been to each other before everything became so complicated. The final photo in the album was from Emily's graduation, but not one of the posed pictures. It was a candid moment captured during the ceremony, showing me clapping as Emily walked across the stage. My face was filled with pride, and it was almost impossible to notice the wheelchair unless you looked closely. She admitted quietly that she had carried shame about the wheelchair for 3 years, but looking at that photo made her realize that the only person who should feel ashamed was her, not because I needed a wheelchair, but because she allowed it to change how she saw me. I find myself looking at that photograph often now. In it, I see a woman who has lived through loss, change, and conflict, but who still found joy in celebrating someone she loves. I see someone who refused to let other people's discomfort become her own. I see myself as complete, valuable, and deserving of respect exactly as I am. Tonight, the house is quiet, but it is a calm and comforting quiet. Tomorrow, Emily will come over for Sunday dinner. Avery may come as well, or she may not, and either outcome will be fine. Isabella will arrive on Monday morning with her usual cheerful energy, ready to help me begin another week of living life on my own terms. My wheelchair rests beside my bed, ready for another day, prepared to take me wherever I choose to go. It is no longer a symbol of limitation. Instead, it represents adaptation, a quiet refusal to let circumstances define my value. I changed my will 8 months ago to protect myself from a daughter who had forgotten how to see me as a person. I have not changed it since, and I likely never will. But I no longer rely on that protection, because Avery has remembered something that truly matters. I am not a burden she has to carry. I am her mother, someone she is meant to love. And that realization has changed everything for both of us. Now I find myself thinking about you, the one listening to my story. What would you have done in her place? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Share your thoughts below. And on the final screen, you will find 2 more stories that viewers often return to, stories that may surprise you as well. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.